It was less inspirational than reactive, actually. Nina Coulthard, who was an analyst in our society, gave a paper called Slouching Towards Bethlehem, where she talks about losing her temper with a patient, and in a way makes a virtue out of this. And my Kleinian colleagues were terrifically critical of her, actually, and I felt critical of making a virtue out of losing one's temper with a patient, but I felt I also knew where she was coming from, that I knew the feeling and the wish to do that very well. So that was actually, it was in reaction to her paper that I set about, and this is the only paper I've written that really came out of a need to say something that wasn't being said. Anything else I've written has always been in response to, will you write a paper about some X, Y, Z? But this, I really felt it needed to be addressed. So that's what it came out of. Well, there was certainly my early training didn't think, didn't talk about, you weren't allowed to have feelings like that. So it was your problem in a way. And I think going back to early Freud, I mean, countertransference was regarded as the analyst's pathology. So then came Paula Hyman's paper, which was very important, about countertransference being something communicated by the patient. And so that was, I think, 1950, if I remember correctly. And that seemed very important. I mean, I took that very seriously. But then there seemed to be this split, or the dichotomy, between either countertransference is pathological or countertransference is a communication from the patient. And actually, it seemed to me it was both. And that somewhere patients knew somehow how to touch on one's pathology. And so one had to deal with that as well as, you know, one had to think about both what the patient was communicating, but some of the difficulty in thinking about what the patient was communicating was because it touched on something internal to oneself, something perhaps unresolved in oneself. So I suppose it was wanting to bring those things together. I did feel it was important because I felt it was something about actually being honest about what the process was. I do feel very strongly about, I mean, I feel increasingly strongly about this as the, I mean, it's now, what is it, 30 years ago, that we want to see ourselves as somehow better than we are, or somehow cured of all these problems, and that these problems exist in the patient, but not in ourselves. And it increasingly feels to me that that cannot be right, that we're never really cured of these early problems. We have the capacity, with the help of analysis, to recover from them, but we're always driven back to primitive, to early places ourselves. And so it seems to me terribly important that we own that in order to be authentic, actually. I have a sort of hobby horse about what I think of as false self-analysts, analysts who behave as though they're something other than what they really are. I think so. I mean, of course, Winnicott spoke also about the holding mother, so it's also linked to that. But I think beyond talking about an internal process that goes on inside the object into whom something is being projected, I think is key to understanding this. I mean, I suppose when I think about it now, which I don't think I thought about it like that at all, then I think there must be also something about the experience of being a mother. And actually knowing that at 2 o'clock in the morning you have this wish to throw your baby out of the window. And that is how it is when they go on screaming and you want to sleep. And that seems a real experience that needs to be thought about and gone through and then your more loving feelings can resurface. But that is something that is in you. We're not ideal mothers, and we're not ideal analysts, and so dealing with those experiences seem to me to be terribly important. The more I think about analytic work, the more it is about being able to hold a balance in some way. That kind of tightrope between getting over-involved with what's being projected into you or distancing yourself too much from the experiences you're having seems to be that one is having and one, like on a tightrope, you're also always in danger of losing your balance and sometimes you may lose your balance. I mean, one doesn't behave like a perfectly balanced analyst either. But anyway, having to recover your balance between these different dangers. You know, I've written a paper recently. When you're old, you think you've only ever written one paper because you're always saying the same thing in some way from different points of view. But I have recently written a paper on authenticity. And I think the dangers of being a false self-analyst, I think it's very not helpful, actually. So when one talks to a patient about their distress about being left at the weekend, let's say, it can very easily just be a textbook interpretation that's not going to touch the patient at all. It's quite different from going through the experience of feeling distressed about being left, knowing what that experience is, and talking from that experience. I think the patient has a very different experience of feeling understood. So what are the dangers? Well, I mean, I suppose there are many. A patient can comply with the false self-analyst, and a false self, duo can come out of this. So a sort of false analysis, false talk, or superficial talk, that doesn't really touch the deeper feelings of the patient. And I think what I said in that patient, and it seems to me right, and the patient senses it, I think, absolutely, even in the tone of your voice and the way you breathe and all sorts of clues that they are picking up about you, about what your capacity is really to take in how they feel. It seems to me fundamental in the mother-infant relationship as well. The apparent action of the mother can, feeding the baby or not feeding the baby can look like the same, but whether the mother takes in the experience of the baby or not seems to me really crucial. So you can hear, I still feel very strongly about it. As well as feeling it's terribly important to go through these experiences, if one's doing analytic work, it also seems to be terribly important to hold the setting, actually. And although there are all sorts of invitations or needs at times to alter the setting, it seems to me the more one can hold the setting, the more helpful it is to really be able to get further in understanding how the patient feels. So when the patient comes with good news, they want congratulations, for instance. And of course one's impulse is to congratulate the patient. I think if one can, it is more helpful to address that with the patient. What the patient hopes for is that you will be able to celebrate this with them, or the patient fears that you won't be able to celebrate this with them, or the patient fears that you're so attached to your technique that that's more important than the patient's feeling. There'd be all sorts of ways of talking about it. which seemed to me to touch a deeper chord than just saying congratulations. Yeah. Now, similarly, with bad news, again, what the patient wants is somebody who will take that in and respond to it. And if one can speak to that wish, maybe sometimes one has to say, I'm sorry. But the speaking to the wish and to the fears associated with the wish, you know, that you will be so detached that you won't be able to take in how they feel, or you will be so identified with their plight that you too will be overwhelmed and unable to help them. There are just all sorts of ways of knowing about the wish that one, because it is also one's own, it's not only the patient, an interesting example of, it's not only that the patient projects that into you, it is also touches on something in you that wants to celebrate with the patient or grieve with the patient. But I think if one can address the wish for that, the longing for that, the fear of that, anyway, whatever it is for that patient, I think that is more helpful than stepping outside the set, you know, the analytic setting, which doesn't mean that one's going to get it perfectly right either way. But I do think the more one can stay with thinking about these things, the more one's able. I had a patient who was a scientist whose chief, his professor in his lab, used to say to him, treasure your unsuccessful results. And I think of that phrase often, because I think these wishes to enact are unsuccessful results. And in a way, I mean, they're what's not wanted in the room, in analysis. And it's not so much that I'm looking for purity, as that I think that if one can stay with those feelings, you have access to more than if you just react to them. There are a couple of other things I would like to say that I wish I'd said in the paper. My paper was followed by a paper by Dennis Carpy on the same subject, where he followed on with these ideas and talked about these processes often being unconscious. And I think he died very young, very sadly, but I thought he was absolutely right. And I wished I'd said that. Because I think the processes, you know, I think I did say they take place sometimes so quickly that you don't notice they're happening. But I think it's more accurate to say that probably a lot of them go on intuitively, unconsciously, and that needed to be said. I also wanted to say something else, if I may, about the question you asked about what was the climate at the time. I spoke recently, recalling, as I said, the paper came in response to Nina Coulthard's paper, but it also came in response to development in my own training linked with Beyond. And maybe I could talk about these influences which were personal rather than in the writing. The one was my early training was very much, as I said, to do with the unconscious fantasies that the child has, and that's what you're engaged with. When I did the adult training, my first supervisor was Herbert Rosenfeld, and my first husband had died just a bit over a year before. And the patient talked about who I would be with at the weekend, thinking about my husband. And Herbert Rosenfeld, in the supervision, who had also been my husband's supervisor, said very gently to me, you know, you're going to need to take that up. Now, actually, I had taken it up, but it was the way he acknowledged that I was going to feel personally touched and affected by this, that actually touched me a lot and gave me the freedom, the permission almost, that it was okay that I had those feelings. It could be talked about. in a way that nobody had ever done before. Well, that was one, and I think it was very important in freeing me up to think about this. The other was Bjorn, who was my second supervisor, but with whom I had earlier had a clinical attended his clinical seminar presenting this first case that Rosenfeld supervised. And I was in a bit of a different place than the rest of my year. I was already a qualified child psychotherapist who'd had a lot of good supervision. I was younger than most of them, but I'd also been recently widowed, so I'd had tough experiences of life, actually. And anyway, I presented the case, and there was just a terrible silence, just awful. Nobody said a word. And I became Bjorn didn't say a word either. And I became anxious and anxiously said, should I be offering more? Should I be giving you more material? And Bjorn said, I think this may be what you're meant to feel. That was all he said. But it was very important, actually, because it allowed me to think about whether this feeling I should be giving more was coming from the patient demanding more, coming from the group, that I wasn't giving them what they wanted, or coming from some place inside me. And it was that capacity then later in the supervision with Bjorn to think about where these things were coming from. And it might not be either or, it might be some aspect of all of them, but he had this capacity in a very non-intrusive way. I mean, he wasn't going into my private world of what might drive me to feel I had to give more, but that opened up the possibilities of thinking across these different spectra. So I think they were very important influences. I mean, they sound like rather banal examples, but that opened up the possibility, that freed one up really, to think that there was a place for these different things, what's coming from the patient, what's coming from outside, from one's supervisor, what's coming from one's own stuff. And I suppose it's working through all of that that seems to me terribly important in what one offers.